and then blowing and spitting upon them. He goes on to relate how once upon a time a wicked Jew bewitched the Prophet Mohammed himself by tying 9 knots on a string, which he then hid in a well. So the Prophet fell ill, and nobody knows what might have happened if the Archangel Gabriel had not opportunely revealed to the holy man the place where the knotted cord was concealed. The trusty Ali soon fetched the baleful thing from the well, and the Prophet recited over it certain charms, which were specially revealed to him for the purpose. At every verse of the charms a knot untied itself, and the Prophet experienced a certain relief. If knots are supposed to kill, they are also supposed to cure. This follows from the belief that to undo the knots which are causing sickness will bring the sufferer relief. But apart from this negative virtue of maleficent knots, there are certain beneficent knots to which a positive power of healing is ascribed. Pliny tells us that some folk cured diseases of the groin by taking a thread from a web, tying 7 or 9 knots on it, and then fastening it to the patient's groin. But to make the cure effectual it was necessary to name some widow as each knot was tied. O'Donovan describes a remedy for fever employed among the Turkomans. The enchanter takes some camel hair and spins it into a stout thread, droning a spell the while. Next he ties 7 knots on the thread, blowing on each knot before he pulls it tight. This knotted thread is then worn as a bracelet on his wrist by the patient. Every day one of the knots is untied and blown upon, and when the 7th knot is undone, the whole thread is rolled up into a ball and thrown into a river, bearing away, as they imagine, the fever with it. Again, knots may be used by an enchantress to win a lover and attach him firmly to herself. Thus the lovesick maid in Virgil seeks to draw Daphnis to her from the city by spells, and by tying 3 knots on each of 3 strings of different colours. So an Arab maiden, who has lost her heart to a certain man, tried to gain his love and bind him to herself by tying knots in his whip. But her jealous rival undid the knots. On the same principle, magic knots may be employed to stop a runaway. In Swaziland you may often see grass tied in knots at the side of the footpaths. Every one of these knots tells of a domestic tragedy. A wife has run away from her husband, and he and his friends have gone in pursuit, binding up the paths, as they call it, in this fashion to prevent the fugitive from doubling back over them. A net, from its affluence of knots, has always been considered in Russia very efficacious against sorcerers. Hence in some places, when a bride is being dressed in her wedding attire, a fishing net is flung over her to keep her out of harm's way. For a similar purpose the bridegroom and his companions are often girt with pieces of net, or at least with tight drawn girdles, for before a wizard can begin to injure them he must undo all the knots in the net, or take off the girdles. But often a Russian amulet is merely a knotted thread. A skein of red wool wound about the arms and legs is thought to ward off agues and fevers, and 9 skeins, fastened round a child's neck, are deemed a preservative against scarlatina. In the Tver government a bag of a special kind is tied to the neck of the cow which walks before the rest of a herd, in order to keep off wolves. Its force binds the maw of the ravening beast. On the same principle a padlock is carried thrice round a herd of horses before they go afield in the spring, and the bearer locks and unlocks it as he goes, saying, "I lock from my herd the mouths of the grey wolves with this steel lock." Knots and locks may serve to avert not only wizards and wolves, but death itself. When they brought a woman to the stake at St. Andrew's in 1572 to burn her alive for a witch, they found on her a white cloth like a collar, with strings and many knots on the strings. They took it from her, sorely against her will, for she seemed to think that she could not die in the fire, if only the cloth with the knotted strings was on her. When it was taken away, she said, "Now I have no hope of myself." In many parts of England it is thought that a person cannot die so long as any locks are locked or bolts shot in the house. It is therefore a very common practice to undo all locks and bolts when the sufferer is plainly near his end, in order that his agony may not be unduly prolonged. For example, in the year 1863 at Taunton, a child lay sick of scarlatina, and death seemed inevitable. A jury of matrons was as it were impanelled, and to prevent the child dying hard, all the doors in the house, all the drawers, all the boxes, all the cupboards were thrown wide open, the keys taken out, and the body of the child placed under a beam, whereby a sure, certain, and easy passage into eternity could be secured. Strange to say, the child declined to avail itself of the facilities for dying so obligingly placed at its disposal by the sagacity and experience of the British matrons of Taunton. It preferred to live rather than give up the ghost just then. The rule which prescribes that at certain magical and religious ceremonies the hair should hang loose and the feet should be bare is probably based on the same fear of trammelling and impeding the action in hand, whatever it may be, by the presence of any knot or constriction, whether on the head or on the feet of the performer. A similar power to bind and hamper spiritual as well as bodily activities is ascribed by some people to rings. Thus in the island of Carpathus people never button the clothes they put upon a dead body, and they are careful to remove all rings from it. For the spirit, they say, can even be detained in the little finger and cannot rest. Here it is plain that even if the soul is not definitely supposed to issue at death from the finger tips, yet the ring is conceived to exercise a certain constrictive influence which detains and imprisons the immortal spirit in spite of its efforts to escape from the tabernacle of clay. In short, the ring, like the knot, acts as a spiritual fetter. This may have been the reason of an ancient Greek maxim, attributed to Pythagoras, which forbade people to wear rings. Nobody might enter the ancient Arcadian sanctuary of the mistress at Lycosura with a ring on his or her finger. Persons who consulted the oracle of Faunus had to be chaste, to eat no flesh, and to wear no rings. On the other hand, the same constriction which hinders the egress of the soul may prevent the entrance of evil spirits. Hence we find rings used as amulets against demons, witches, and ghosts. In the Tyrol it is said that a woman in childbed should never take off her wedding ring, or spirits and witches will have power over her. Among the Lapps the person who is about to place a corpse in the coffin receives from the husband, wife, or children of the deceased a brass ring, which he must wear fastened to his right arm until the corpse is safely deposited in the grave. The ring is believed to serve the person as an amulet against any harm which the ghost might do to him. How far the custom of wearing finger rings may have been influenced by, or even have sprung from, a belief in their efficacy as amulets to keep the soul in the body, or demons out of it, is a question which seems worth considering. Here we are only concerned with the belief in so far as it seems to throw light on the rule that the Flamen Dialis might not wear a ring unless it were broken. Taken in conjunction with the rule which forbade him to have a knot on his garments, it points to a fear that the powerful spirit embodied in him might be trammelled and hampered in its goings out and comings in by such corporeal and spiritual fetters as rings and knots. Chapter 22